following us this morning, and I made sure to bring my cup of coffee to the talk this morning. Hoping you brought yours. Did you get yours, Matt?
I have yet to get it.
All right. Well, anyway.
As we pay.
Let's get started, Matt. Since folks already know what it is we're going to be talking about, there's a couple things that we should do just to kind of get the discussion started and get folks to be thinking about this particular book, its content, and then eventually its applicability, not just for the moment, the viral moment in which we find ourselves, Matt, but particularly as far as Chicana and Chicano people are concerned. You know, what is the well, to use some language from the book, what is the use value of this particular text for Chicanas and Chicanos? So what do you think, Matt? Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
All right. How to begin? I'm interested in just maybe even stepping back just a bit and sharing that there is in addition to the theoretical value of the book and the significance of the book about which we're going to discuss, I think that there's also something that we should recognize, and that is that the book gives us a platform with which to make sense of a variety of experiences in which we find ourselves. I certainly am interested in the book for that general reason, and specifically as far as Chicana and Chicano workers are concerned. And anyway, so that's what brings me to the book, and that's what has been basic to my engagement with the book. I see that the work that I do and the work that others do, either in the context of the classroom as a quote-unquote factory of knowledge or as a workshop of knowledge, for instance, is useful for making sense of the understandings that we produce and reproduce in the context of the classroom, and then, of course, how those understandings figure in those understandings that students themselves have about themselves as human beings and as workers once they leave the classroom. And so that's my particular take on this book, Matt. Anything you want to add before we get into the thick of today's discussion?
No, I mean, I think that's just before we get into it, I think it's really important to remember that this book is called Capital, but the first opening chapter is about the commodity, and so when we think about the commodity, we can think about a commodity as a kind of a basic unit of capital, and it's the thing. The commodities are really the stuff of life, right? But they're actually under this system turned into something else. Yeah, and it forces us to relate to each other through not the stuff of life, but rather through commodities. So it commodifies our interactions. It financializes our interactions. So I think that's almost getting into what we're going to talk about later. But I really think that it's really important that Marx chose to start the book this way.
Yeah. Well, let's get started. There's a few terms that I want to introduce, and then I want to go about defining them partially, and then hopefully more completely as the discussion proceeds. Of course, the first term is the term commodity, and then the subsequent terms about which we will discuss in relation to commodity, right, are going to be use value, exchange value, and then the concept value itself. There is there is a distinction that Marx makes as far as products of human labor are concerned. He makes a distinction between a human product and a commodity. And this particular division is important because to the extent that he recognizes any particular item that is made by way of the systems of capitalist industrial production, right? What he does is that he links the production of commodities, no longer simply human products. He links them to a historical moment, and links them to a set of relationships that exist within a particular moment, a set of relationships about which we've already read and discussed, and we talked about in our last episode 1, Matt. Anyway, I'd like to just briefly go over the concept, use value, exchange value, and then value, and then I'll turn it over to you. Okay, Matt? All right, great. So use value, right, is the utility of a particular product, the utility of a particular artifact, such that it might satisfy a human need or a human desire. The next concept, of course, I'm being very short, because we'll be talking about these as the conversation proceeds. The next term, of course, is the term exchange value, and of course, this is the concept that introduces and gives Marx the capacity, the ability to then talk about the relationships that exist between folks and amongst folks within the capitalist historical moment, and that is that the exchange value of a commodity is its capacity to accrue a corresponding proportion of value or use value from another commodity. And of course, the proportions, of course, aren't necessarily equal. And of course, we'll be talking about these inequitable relationships where folks who possess commodities encounter one another and then engage in, capitalist relations with one another. And then finally is the term value. And value, as Marx discusses, is the quantity of socially necessary labor time that is invested in a particular commodity or set of commodities. Matt?
Yeah, well, I think, it's so interesting, rereading chapter 1, because, Marx was so, it's not like he just wrote these things to be like, this is what I think about the world. He wrote these in the midst of like a struggle, in the midst of people, arguing with him. And so he's trying so he's making a real effort to make these really airtight arguments, which when you already kind of agree with him, it's kind of like, this is like, oh my God, like, okay, I get it, right? But I think in the process of him making the airtight arguments, really interesting when he talks about this concept of like, well, would the product of a lazy worker be more valuable because there would be more time put into it? Yeah. Like if it takes like, the average person takes like 10 minutes to make this pencil, right? But then another person takes like 30 minutes to make the pencil. Is the 30-minute pencil worth more than the 10-minute pencil because it was that much more labor? He says, no, it's not a question of that individual thing, right? Diamonds are rare on Earth, but if someone just stumbles upon a diamond, is that diamond worth less than a diamond mined more traditionally? Like the answer again is no, because we're talking about a pool of human labor and what that human labor would be when we put it into the commodity. So I know I'm going a little straight from what you were saying, but what's really interesting to me is this when we talk about the commodity, when we talk about the exchange value, that's based upon the human labor that goes into it. but it's not this one-to-one relationship of the human labor that's put into this exact pencil, that exact cup, that exact diamond, that exact piece of gold. And it's always really interesting when I was, when we were reading Capital, to see like just how airtight, Marx was interesting making like most of his argumentation, because again, there are people who then as today are trying to poke holes at it, and it really is a tremendous work. And when, well, yeah, but
No. I mean, I don't want to cut you short. Finish your thought, please.
Oh yeah. No, so this is really tremendous work, and I think that's really important when we discuss the commodity, that we're not necessarily talking about this one-to-one relationship. Of I worked this hard on this binder because maybe I didn't know how to do it, and you're more experienced at making binders, and therefore you did it quicker, but mine should be more value. Otherwise, Karl Marx was wrong. That's not exactly how it works. I think that's really important when we're talking about the value of commodities.
Go ahead. No.
I'm getting way ahead of myself because I'm just thinking.
All right.
Because what you're saying is so.
I'm going to say something about that relationship, about socially necessary labor time. As I was thinking about this particular chapter once more last night, as I was getting ready for this morning's discussion, I was taking note, and again, one's mind begins to go in a variety of routes, based on what one reads. And one discovers, as one is reading, a whole series of implications that are there. And then, really interestingly, the implications have been set in one's mind very subtly, latently, perhaps, within the reading. And then they are exposed later on. And I was thinking about something just now as you were talking, thinking about socially necessary labor time, that if this pen takes, this pen that I happen to have in my hand at the moment takes one person 10 minutes to produce, and the other pen takes the other worker 30 minutes to produce, that the distinction in time doesn't make one pen more valuable, doesn't make it so that one pen is more valuable, or contains more value rather than the other. What distinguishes the socially necessary labor time, as far as these pens are concerned, the cup of coffee or the bagel that I have there on the desk, whatever it might be, whatever commodity in question it might be, has to do with the technological conditions in a particular historical moment that are the prevailing ones, that in which commodities are configured and produced, such that if a machine produces, I don't know how fast a machine produces a particular pen, but if a machine produces a pen in 10 seconds, and 10 seconds, of course, is 1/6 of a minute, and another person produces a pen in 10 minutes, right? Then it's just a matter of, engaging in a mathematical equation to find out what the proportional value of that pen is, right? Not just the pen produced by the machine, but the pen produced by the human being, such that technology in the past, machinery, steam machinery, eventually, gasoline, electrical energy, or machinery, right, becomes the overarching basis for understanding the value contained in things produced as much by machinery as those produced by human beings. But I suppose, like you shared just a few moments ago, I think I might be getting ahead of myself, getting excited about the implications that we're addressing at the moment.
Well, I think just to bring it back down to earth, though, I'll just real briefly in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
If the standard operating expectation is that you should be able to make a pen in 10 minutes, and you're a worker that takes half an hour to make a pen, you will get fired.
Yeah.
Like, so I mean, like, if the standard operating expectation is like this should take 10 minutes because we know that people doing this after 2 days can do this in 10 minutes, and it's taking you half an hour for a whole month, you're going to get fired. Yeah. So, like, because that's kind of like the way there's a standard expectation. I think Marx referred to it as like the pool of human labor, or something to describe that, the pool of human labor power. Yeah. So there was a distinction maybe between labor and labor power, but that was what he described. So I don't know, that part always that part really captured my imagination again. But getting back to what we were talking about, use value versus exchange value, exchange value again gets back to why did he start with the commodity, and the exchange value is like how things, everything in this world that we have is being bought and sold, and that is and it's being produced for the sale. Yeah. So that's the exchange. That's the idea of the thing being a commodity, right? It's more complicated than that, but that's the thing. That's the idea of it being a commodity. But then there's what you can actually use it for, which is like what it's for. And he describes in the second part of chapter 1, he describes something about like we've had clothes forever, but no one decided to be a tailor until like a certain point in time, right? No one became a tailor because that was when things were being produced for their material use, the material benefit, and not being produced for the sale. You wouldn't have tailors. So like that was kind of that was getting back to what we originally started the conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's the conditions. It's the conditions of production in a given historical moment that, according to this particular book, is the one that sets the standards for not just for our interactions with one another, the boss, or the boss in relation to the worker, for instance, or the boss as supervisor in relation to the owner of the factory, and the owner of the factory in relation to the banks, that set up the lending system in which the factory owner depends, and so on, right? So there are all these relationships in which we find ourselves that contextualize our interactions. And what is particularly interesting for me as far as this is concerned, I was just a few moments ago, I was reading one of the biographies that I have, and this particular biography is one of Marx, and of course I haven't read the so-called third volume or fourth volume of Kapital yet, and that's on my bucket list. But anyways, as I understand from reading the biography, one of the things that Marx does is that he examines the work of a criminal, and he lays out in this particular quote from the fourth volume, I think it is, of the book. What he does is he lays out a series of workers, a poet, a teacher, a priest, and a criminal. Mm-hmm. And he highlights the work of the criminal and the capacity of the criminal to generate subsequent employments, right? And these employments, of course, depend on the criminal's existence. So it's a really funny, interesting discussion. But all of this, of course, exists because of the shifts that take place in history, such that, according to the chronology and the historiography in the book about which we discussed last week, humanity makes, at least European humanity, makes a transition from from a agricultural subsistence system where folks share the commons, right? And then once the bourgeoisie imposes itself upon society and usurps the commons for itself, privatizes and monopolizes these, it is that all these subsequent relationships, some of which are relationships between the criminal and the victim, as it were, or the producer of the pen and the user of the pen, and then of course the factory owner of the pen. All these things surface as a consequence of these relationships. I wonder if we can take some time, Matt, to think about the relationship of the things that we're talking about, or rather the things that we're talking about in relation to society today, just a little more specifically, and then perhaps ease into a discussion of these concepts to understand the historical moment, and then close with a discussion of the pertinence of this stuff to understand the experiences of Chicanos today, April 6th, I think it is, April 6th, 2020.
Yeah, we actually have a question right here. And it says, what about the time and knowledge it takes to train a person to make that pencil? And what about the investors who risk their finances to provide material and machinery for the person to make that pencil?
Yeah.
And so I think this is a really good question that, I mean, I think that it's kind of asked combatively, but I could just be assuming that. I could be assuming that from text. Either way, I don't care. It's a good question.
Yeah.
What about the time and knowledge it takes to train the person? Well, that's actually part of the production of the worker. I mean, that's part of what goes into making the worker capable of being exploited. If they don't know how to make a pencil, you cannot exploit them, right? And what do I mean by exploitation? I mean this in a very technical way. I don't mean this in like, oh my God, you're hurting me. I mean that. I do mean that, but I also mean it not just directly to say you're being oppressed. I mean, you're being exploited, and that means something very specific. And that means that you're being paid less than what you produce, right? So if I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money, that that's the money I'm paying you so that you stay alive and you come back to work. That's the necessary labor to keep you alive, right? And what goes beyond that is the surplus. So this is what I do not pay you, and what I do not pay you is the variable, because these other things that Isaiah is asking about are actually the variable, are actually the static. That's actually the constant. When he's talking about the raw materials to make that, and the investment that goes in to pick up those raw materials, and the machinery necessary that an individual will engage with in making, taking these raw materials and turning it into a pencil, those are also constant. But the variable is the human labor. And whatever I do not pay the worker, that is going to be my rate of profit. That's going to be the surplus labor that I as a capitalist, that I as this investor have taken on. So that's really good. And Benjamin Wood as asking if he was wondering if we're going to take questions, and the answer to that is the answer it always is for me when it comes to taking questions. Only if it serves me. Or the conversation.
Well, I want to actually respond to Isaiah Arevalo, because I think we've addressed his question already to some extent, and then there's a portion of his question that has yet been unanswered that I also want to address. Certainly, the investor or the factory owner, the individual that's buying the machinery, etc., or sees himself or sees herself and is seen to be, but of course, there's a distinction between appearances and reality, and I suppose we can talk about those in a little while. But in any case, I see myself to be the the owner of the pencil factory, and the world sees me to be the owner of the pencil factory, and the world sees me, and I see myself to be making the investment in the machinery, in the space, in the factory, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly, there absolutely is a risk, and the risk is one that is historical in nature. In other words, I am putting myself in the ring, as it were, in a ring of other pencil manufacturers, right? And so what we find ourselves doing is not just, we don't only find ourselves in competition, as it were, with our pencil makers, or the employees that we that have surrendered their labor and their value for the production of the pencil, but we also find ourselves in competition with other manufacturers, and also find ourselves in competition with the bank that has set up the system of payment, such that if I, as the pencil factory owner, have not accrued a quantity of value to be surrendered over to the bank, right, I will, my factory, my manufacturing, pencil manufacturing factory is going to go under, is going to disappear. So always looking to exploit as much as possible, and to extract as much value both from workers and from the environment, such that I can keep enough for myself as the factory owner, and in spite of the challenges that are imposed on me by the capitalist system that surrounds me. Then secondly, and I hope I'm not it's just that the question is a really interesting one, and it's a very thought-provoking one that I also want to address. In fact, there's language in Kapital with which to make sense of Isaiah's question, and that question has to do, of course, with the training of the pencil makers. There's discussion in Marx, and we'll get to it in later chapters of the book, where there are those persons that are subjected to formal relations. I think the term is formal systems of exploitation, I think is the terminology in the book, such that they are subsequently found in real systems of exploitation. I forget the exact terminology at the moment, but be that as it may, for the moment, of course, the term formal finds itself in the term, and the word real finds itself in the term about which I'm alluding to in this particular moment. Anyway, so that formal relations of exploitation, or formal relations of oppression, he uses the term formal relations of subjection, are those relationships in which persons in various institutions are cultivated as workers for their subsequent real subjection later, at some later moment of their life, so that students find themselves in exploitative relationships where the educator, qua supervisor, is imposing a set of standards to which the students, qua workers, must abide, such that over the span of their education, much more important for the pencil making industry than them being able to count and add and divide and so on, is that they know their place, they surrender to authority, that they exist, they divide their days in particular ways, such that once they receive their high school diploma, or whatever it is that, whatever it is that signifies their transition from one stage to the next, they are well prepared to be obedient and compliant workers who won't organize, who won't discuss the conditions of their existence, and who will aspire to be the factory owner.
Yeah, I think, but when we look at this question of like of the pencil, though. I mean, of the production of pencils. When we talk about the role of the capitalist in this, yeah, capitalists succeed and fail all the time.
Yeah.
All the time, and more often than not, small businesses, which try to go on to be larger businesses, more often than not they fail, right?
Yeah.
So it's a risky proposition indeed. But to succeed, right? Should you succeed as a capitalist, you will succeed when you are able to exploit a large number of people. That is capitalist success. So to say that, like someone like try to do something and like, we should favor them for their endeavor. I mean, that's like saying like, well, someone's gonna go out and be a pirate, right? And you know that most people that go out for the pirate life end up drowning. Like what about that? Well, I mean, that doesn't change the fact that they go around engaging in piracy, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
When we think about kind of capitalists, I think that's the way to think about it. I mean, like we talk about someone like risking everything and trying to whatever do that, and I think that when we talk about this, to oftentimes people think in terms of, I mean, people think in terms of the question of their ability to do things. They think of the question of like things on the scale that they are accustomed to, right? So when we talk about, say, like the idea that you're exploiting someone, so it's even a small business person, right, who's got a small business and they're working alongside 5 other people, and they're whatever. Are they necessarily exploiting these people? Maybe in a technical capacity, yes, but maybe more often than not, they're working harder than everyone else, and they're actually losing money paying people, right? So that's not a successful that's not a successful capitalist enterprise. That is somebody, chasing their dreams and helping out their friends or something like that, right? And you're like, how dare you say I'm exploiting my friends here? I care about these people. I'm paying them. I'm losing money here, right? What are you talking about? Well, that's not a successful capitalist enterprise, and that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that you're a successful capitalist when you are living off the exploitation of other people, of other individuals. Like when you live off their labor, you have now succeeded in the realm of capital. And so that is that's the dream of capital, which is to have the thing working whether or not you show up on Monday or not. You know what I'm saying? If Jeff Bezos doesn't show up to his desk, he's still going to make money. You know what I'm saying? If all these people that own these giant things do not go to work, they are still going to make money. And that's kind of the dream of being a capitalist, just to make money in your sleep. While others are working. It's not like, you're just like, oh, yeah. I mean, like others are working for you to make money. So that is what it means to be successful as a capitalist. So whether someone succeeds or fails in this endeavor does not change what success in this endeavor means.
Yeah. So one of the definitions that I introduced at the outset of our discussion, almost a half an hour, time's flying. We've got about 25 minutes to go or so, Matt. One of the definitions that I introduced at the outset of our discussion this morning is the concept of value. And I, taking notes as I did last night about this particular chapter. Marx sets out to identify human labor as this generalizable thing, a thing that exists as much in action of the domestic worker, the gardener, the construction worker, the teacher, the poet, and the librarian, right? And in so doing, what he does is he recognizes that work shares, all these workers share something in common, that they are engaging in a set of exercises, mental exercises and physical exercises, right, for the production of commodities. And really basic then to this discussion is that as workers, they all find themselves within the capitalist system. There's other things that I haven't addressed given the time at the moment, Matt. But we're gearing ourselves for a discussion about this language, the language of workers, or rather the language about workers, to understand today, and to understand the last month, really to understand the last 3 or 4 months, but especially this last month, and then subsequently to understand the experiences of Chicana and Chicano workers. So in the 20 minutes or so that we have remaining for our discussion, how might we begin to make sense of the value of Chicana and Chicano workers in this particular moment, given the existing conditions, and then, to what conclusions might we arrive about Chicana and Chicano workers who find themselves disproportionately in service-oriented systems of production, and in the contemporary moment here in Southern California, in the LA metropolitan region in particular, one way or another tied to the sports, entertainment, and hospitality industry.
Well, I think that the biggest thing, I mean, again, why it's really fruitful for us to have been reading these first few chapters of Kapital is that, again, it begins with the commodity, right? And we see so many people being pushed out of, as they're being pushed out of their ability to sell their labor, right? To sell their labor power, their ability to labor. As that is happening, just because they can't make money does not necessarily mean, or because so many people can't make money, does not necessarily mean that it does not necessarily mean at all that the items of life, the stuff of life, ceases to be commodities, right? So just because your position as a worker has been threatened, your position as a consumer remains. Your position of like lack of guarantee, the fact that these things, that toilet paper is made to be sold, doesn't change. The fact that ventilators are made to be sold doesn't change. The fact that like masks are made to be sold doesn't change. Latex gloves are meant to be sold, not distributed, not freely distributed, does not change, simply because your ability to pay for them is being put in flux, or the actual amount that exists is being called into question, because like we don't live in a latex glove economy. We don't live in a ventilator driven economy. We don't live in a a medical mask driven economy. Like there are other products, other commodities that are far more often sold in times of non-pandemic times. And because the economy runs on the production of these things that people kind of tend to buy, right? We have mass shortages of these things that we need in a totally predictable crisis, in a totally predictable moment. I mean, for those whose job it is to consider what will millions of people need should this happen, should X, Y, and Z happen, right? And there's people whose jobs that is to do, right? They did not produce the things that would be necessary in this current moment, right? And they didn't do it because they don't control they themselves, even if they wanted to, these government officials, even if they wanted to, do not control the commanding heights of the economy, which is to talk about, to introduce the phrase of another Marxist, right? They don't control the commanding heights of the economy. So who does? I mean, who does are these capitalists. Who does these capitalists and those who and their legal teams, known as like the Congress and the Senate, right? So that's who controls this, and that's why in this moment we don't have the things we need to deal. Like any of us have the things we need to do. I mean, we as all of us, right, do not have what we don't have the stuff of life necessary, because the stuff of life was not produced, because the stuff of life in this country and throughout most of the world are commodities, and we're not going to make a giant surplus of things that cannot be sold. And that's the way it is.
We find ourselves, at least here in the LA metropolitan region, in an economic context where the quantity of goods, tangible goods, to use the reality of the pencil or the metaphor of the pencil, where the quantity of pencils that were produced in previous historical moments aren't produced anymore. And in fact, I think it'd be a very interesting study, Matt, to see where in fact ventilators, since we're bringing this up, where in fact ventilators are, in what region they're being produced. What global region ventilators are being produced. I bet $10 to a donut that it's likely in some Asian nation. But be that as it may, for the moment, Matt, that we find ourselves both as, and generally speaking, as Chicana and Chicano people, on the one hand, we find ourselves such that our work is remunerated less and less, and that our value, our monetary, numerical value, that is, is disregarded, and rather is extracted more and more, and so less value is saved in the person. At that same time, of course, our buying power is reduced. And then we find ourselves, secondly, within a particular moment, much like a bottleneck, if you will, much like the proverbial cars trying to get out of the freeway exit, where everybody is rushing to grab on to the commodities that are required for the sustenance and existence of their lives, be that toilet paper, or be that ventilators, or be that whatever it might be in this particular moment. How are we to make sense of ourselves as Chicana and Chicano workers with under these conditions, where our value is reduced, our purchasing power is reduced, and the demands and the requirements of society are great. And then the people that occupy the commanding heights of capitalist power are making decisions such that the commodities that we need are unavailable for our existence, and our remuneration is decreased simultaneously. I think that this is a necessary question to make sense of ourselves as Chicana and Chicano people. What do you think?
I think it's very difficult sometimes to talk about specifically, like, get the numbers on what's going on with the Chicanos, because they don't disaggregate the data, right? Oftentimes, I mean, the Pew Research does a good job of disaggregating some stuff.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the big statistics we end up getting are usually drawn from every group of people that would fall into the category of the so-called Hispanics, as they say, but Latinos, right? And so when we look at that, though, I mean, the numbers, I mean, are the economic condition of Mexicanos is not so different than Puerto Ricans or Salvadorans or Guatemala. So there's a lot of groups that we find ourselves in very similar positions. There's some outliers like Ecuadorians, Peruvians, but for the most part, we kind of like fit into this kind of category of kind of the workhorses of this economy. Regionally it breaks down different places, but those stats, though not perfect, are still very telling, right? So according to some of the most recent stats I was reading, only 16% of I guess we'll say Chicanos would also fit in this category. Only 16% of people are actually able to do what you and I are doing right now, which is like work from home or whatever, right? So that would mean that 84 can't, right? So 84% of our community are either losing their jobs or risking their health in this moment.
Yeah.
Right. And that is for African Americans, I think the number is 20. So I mean, it's also a complete disaster. And you look at like what's going on in Chicago with the death rates and how disproportionate Black that is, and how in Milwaukee as well, and a few other places. So obviously the effects of that are being felt. But again, we similarly are in a position where we are either losing our jobs or risking our health, and that's just the wide majority of us, right? So about 84% of us are unable to do what you and I are able to do right now.
Yeah.
And so that is a really those are, and just because you and I are able to do this does not mean that means you and I are lucky. I mean, it means you and I are just whatever. I mean, that means something, I guess, in our personal lives. But what does that mean in the context of this conversation, the conversation we're having right now about what the community is going through? This is a complete disaster. I mean, this is horrible. It's horrific.
Yeah.
And it's horrific for everyone, but it's particularly horrific for ours and other communities as well. I mean, but it's particularly horrific in the context of this conversation, particularly horrific for our community. I mean, this is we're experiencing this at a higher rate. I mean, it's similar to the housing crisis. I mean, like, the housing crisis was terrible on everyone. I mean, foreclosures, everyone's getting foreclosed. It's a horrible, horrible time. A lot of mass economic insecurity. But who lost the largest amount of quote unquote wealth during the housing crisis? It was the so-called Latinos, right? In proportion to what they had, and in proportion to what was lost. So again, we find ourselves kind of at the bottom of these like working conditions. We find ourselves as kind of the workhorse of this economy. When things go, we're the lowest paid. I mean, if you look at what's so-called what they call the wage scale, the wage gap at the very bottom is a Latina, right? Yeah. But if you actually go through it, it's not just the wage scale is gendered, obviously, and the women of every group make less than the men, right? But the wage scale is also racial. So you can find all these different of the demographics, right? So the lowest paid of the men are the Latinos, right? Yeah. So like, the lowest paid of everyone is the Latina, but the lowest paid men are the Latinos. So we are like at the bottom of this economy, period. And so, and we have a very particular role within the economy. And again, that is that of the workhorse. And what I'm saying right now can be proved by statistics, but this is just known. This is known in everyday life. Yeah. In everyday life, you know this. Like, you know this. You know this in our culture. You know this just taking a quick survey of who does what jobs. I mean, this is just something that is known. And it's very interesting, though, when you make a political point of it, then all of a sudden people want to argue. Then people want to get argued, right? But when you just like make an everyday, like if you make a joke out of it, people will laugh. If you make a just kind of like, well, whatever, people will nod, right? But the minute you politicize it, all of a sudden, people come out of the woodwork from all kinds of directions to depoliticize the very proletarian nature or the proletarian position of brown people in the United States of America. That is a very important thing to them, to make sure that is not politicized, that is not political, that is simply the way things are. And I think that in some ways that has a lot to do with us not doing enough to fight back and to penalize people for saying certain things, or create enough body of literature that it's easy for people to point to, or we're spreading knowledge of the body of literature that already exists, right? So and taking it just outside the hands of just specialized groups of people. I think that there's a big part of the responsibility that falls upon us to do that. And when I say us, I don't mean like the community. I mean Matt Sedillo, Jose Prado. I mean that there's very specific responsibility for people who are in positions like you and me to talk to people that we really need to get in gear over. But I also think that I think that there is definitely a push to not allow this very basic truth that everybody knows from being politicized.
Yeah. And at the same time, for instance, that farm workers, most of whom, especially in the Southwest and Southwest agricultural economy, most of whom are folks from Mexico, and their children working, in the agricultural system of the nation. At the same time that that they're being excluded from opportunities to obtain some sustenance in these trying times. It's at that same time that, and in keeping with what you're talking about, to depoliticize the circumstances, or rather the circumstances of ruthless terror landed upon them, in particular, these particular generally Mexican people. At the same time that this is happening, the discussion, the capacity to politicize this experience is removed to the extent that we are to simply applaud them for sacrificing themselves for the greater good. Much like much in ways that are not altogether different from the ways in which the Texas governor was, and I think even the president of the nation here in the United States was commenting that some folks, need to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, as if, they don't contain the same quantity of value or the same quantity of importance for us. I want to applaud now in this moment, a professor over at Cal State Bakersfield who sent out an email recently. Professor's name is Gonzalo Santos, for laying light on the particular circumstances of this particular a moment, as far as these Mexican workers are concerned here in California and in the Bakersfield area a little more specifically. But really, this takes us to a discussion that we had about the closing chapters of the book last week, Matt, and that has to do with not just the circumstances of ruthless terror that are identified as being the systems that were landed upon exploited workers, in Western Europe at the time, but also the ways in which the economy is weaponized. The ways in which the economy is weaponized against workers to ensure that, they are continually squeezed and put in positions from which they can't escape, and to, as it were, guarantee the superordinate position of those folks that find themselves, as you mentioned, in the commanding heights of the economy.
Right. Well, I think it actually takes us really into we have a comment here, and actually speaks to a lot of what we were talking about last week, and as well as what we're talking about right now. Yeah. And this says, more important is that our Chicano Mexicano people have entered an ecology of deprivation. What I mean is they are so highly regulated as person proper and as non-person status that they have no other way to survive but to surrender their bodies and labor in exchange for money. In Los Angeles, you can't even grow food, your own food.
Yeah.
So I think that actually speaks to what Karl Marx was describing as proletarialization. I mean, that is what it is.
Yeah.
The fact that, we're talking about workers, right? But you're not born a worker. You're born a person. You're born a human being. You're born, you're born, a member of this species. You're born, right? And then it is through life that you are forced to become a worker, right? And in the case of a capitalist system, an exploited worker, right? Or you're maybe a little ambitious and you're able to rise in the bones of others and you become the exploiter, right? Those are two options in the capitalist society. And I think that the commentators on here is absolutely correct. I mean, we are in a situation where we're mentally beat down too. I mean, and it's not just Chicanos. Everyone here is so mentally beat down. But I think that we are beat down in a very particular way within this country, that any of us, if we would just start talking about it, would recognize, right? But I think that that is a perfect description of what we're facing here. We're facing the fact that we're entering into an ecology of deprivation where we have no choice but to do these things.
Yeah.
And I think that yeah, and pointing to the fact that we can't even grow our food really speaks to like how much, you know, they really, how the political system is there to make sure that you're a proletariat. It's there to make sure you're proletariat. And like if you look at the case, and we have case studies, and look at the South Central Farm, it was able to feed people, right? That had to be shut down. And then the minute, you know, like that, they had a kind of peculiar, you know, thing with the owner, the landowner, the absentee landowner was like, let's shut this down. All of the political machine moved to make sure, ensure that happened, right? Because the political system is there to proletarize you, right? And when we're talking about workers, and sometimes there's a new term called workerism, where people are like, don't focus just on workers. What about people who are out of work? Well, that's true. But we're all proletariat, meaning that our survival is dependent upon the sale of our labor power, our labor, our ability to labor. That is how we are supposed to survive, right? And so we end up leaning on other workers. We end up leaning on other proletariat. We end up figuring out what we're going to do, hard scrambling, etc. But our position as proletariat, we hold that position whether we are working or not. You know, like we're talking about workers and out of workers. You know, like that's our position in society, and not just us. I mean, like that's everybody. But like that's kind of it's really, really important to understand that when we refer to workers, we're talking about the fact that you have to work, not necessarily that you have work right now. You know?
I'm really interested in this particular comment made by Sanya Juan Ipalnemoa. And of course, I would, I don't mean to, you know, split hairs as it were at the moment, but I would use the term economy of deprivation as opposed to the ecology of deprivation. But that's, you know, perhaps that's not as significant as really what he's talking about. George Garcia, hello, George, says 54% of fresh fruit and 30% of fresh fruit consumed in the U.S. is imported. Absolutely. Well, I don't know those particular statistics. I'm taking them as accurate. Certainly, this particular question or this particular comment made by Professor George Garcia is important because it lays to bear the reality of the fact that as workers, Chicana and Chicano agricultural workers in the United States find themselves in a brotherhood and sisterhood with folks that are growing and producing and picking avocados, for instance, in Guerrero, that are growing and picking and packing and transporting grapes in Chile. You know, be wherever it is that these particular commodities are produced, that we find ourselves in relation with other people. I think that's a very important observation. The nature of our discussion has to do, to begin with at least, with the experiences of Chicana and Chicano people in our immediate surroundings, in our particular geographic community. And hopefully the expectation is that by way of questions such as yours, George, by way of comments such as yours, San, by way of questions such as yours, who was it that asked the question earlier, Isaiah, by way of these discussions, we can begin to make the kind of leaps that are necessary that link us here and the particular circumstances of our experiences here in the LA metropolitan region, that link us to other locations. Between now and that moment, however, I think that we ought to be identifying, immediate circumstances.
I remember reading not a while back, and I just checked it right now because the stats have changed. Yeah. I remember reading about how Thailand was the world's leading rice exporter.
Yeah.
And the Philippines was the world's leading rice importer, right? And this idea that, And then I was reading about all the different things that Cargill, the company, was doing in Thailand. And I mean, it was just really the idea that, you know, that the ties, that the capital is this great thing, the capital is going to feed people or something like that. Why is Thailand sending rice out? There are a lot of hungry people in Thailand. Why is the Philippines importing rice? The Philippines they've grown rice since they developed agriculture. You know, I mean, this is like one of the big staples of food out there, right? So this is kind of like, why is this? And today, it turns out the world, you know what the world's largest importer of rice today is?
China.
It is China.
Yeah.
It's China. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. You know the world's biggest exporter of rice is?
It might be the U.S.
It's India.
India.
So these are people. These are groups of people who have developed rice since the beginnings of their agricultural revolution, when that took place in those places thousands and thousands of years ago. These are food staples that have been part of Chinese and Indian like diets for thousands of years, and because of capital, is what's going on. And there's plenty of hungry people in both countries. There's plenty of hungry people in this country too. I'm not trying to like point the finger out. But it's a ridiculous thing. It's a ridiculous thing because rice is a commodity, so it has to be sold in the market. Yeah. You know, it's not there for its material use, which is to eat, right? Yeah. And you're talking about places that have produced this stuff, rice, the stuff of life, for thousands of years. And yet, what does capital bring to the table? Capital brings nothing to the table, but the market, and when the market produces,
capital takes from the table. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about rice and its relationship to Asia, and rice and its relationship, actually, as I understand, rice is one of the was, as I understand, originally produced and consumed in Eastern Africa, and of course, it made its way around that particular region. But a comparable discussion, of course, and one that's particularly relevant for us as Chicano and Chicano people is corn.
I knew you did. Me too. I was even though I was saying it, I was thinking it like corn. You got the corn.
Corn. Yeah. As I understand, Mexico is importing more corn, right, than it's producing for its own consumption, and it's by way of, and this is why I think George's question earlier, George Garcia's question is so important earlier, is because certainly the conditions of farmers and working people in Mexico right now are in very specific ways determined by the political relationships and the economic relationships that exist between those in the commanding heights of power in Mexico and those in the commanding heights of power in the United States. In fact, some of these folks are interlopers. They're one and the same.
I think that I think we probably should start closing the discussion down. But I mean, I think the most interesting thing is that when you talk about corn specifically, what does capital bring to the table? What's capital do? Capital takes corn, something that has been like traded and something that has made its way up and down throughout the Americas, throughout the Western Hemisphere, long before the European invasion, and it turned into corn syrup, and corn oil, and corn. Just these ridiculous uses for corn that are literally destroying people's bodies, like in terms of like, corn syrup, so it's just really unhealthy, disgusting, and it brings nothing to the table. It takes from the table, and it takes from the table, and it brings back something as disgusting as corn syrup, right? And so that's kind of and that actually is a really good description of what capital is and what it does and how it functions in the world.
Yeah.
That it could take corn and turn into corn syrup.
Yeah. Do we wrap it up?
Yeah, let's wrap. I guess we should wrap it up. I mean, I think my closing point would just be like, if you look at our current moment, you find that we don't have a planned economy. We have a chaotic economy. We have a chaotic economy that is controlled by people who they sell products, right? And it's not necessarily it's not even the way they present it, because they create demand. They create demand because they own the companies that do the advertisement. So they create the demand and they supply that demand. And these demands are not necessarily the things that we really need in life. And they certainly, and if there's not an immediate need, there's not an immediate market, the thing won't be produced. And because a thing won't be produced unless there's an immediate market, that's why we don't have ventilators. That's why we don't have masks. That's why we don't have latex gloves. These gloves, there are tattoo artists, and people try to do the right thing oftentimes. There are tattoo artists donating gloves, right? And that's a good thing that they're doing that, but that's a disgrace. This is what's going on right now. Yeah. There are veterinarians donating ventilators. That's a beautiful thing that they're doing that. That's a disgrace. And the wildest thing of all was in DC, there was a group of priests who went down to the crypt and they found a bunch of masks and they donated those masks. And that's cool that they donated those masks. But again, that's a disgrace. That's a disgrace. That's a disgrace that we're relying on mask hoarding, crypt diving priests to supply our hospitals. That's not a good situation. And that is a complete product of the market. The virus is part of nature and it's part of life and it's part of just the way the world is, the ways of the universe. But the response in this country and the lack thereof is absolutely a product of the market.
I think that a good way to close finally our discussion, Matt, is to talk a little bit. I'll try to keep my mouth shut as much as possible. It's just that San asks us to recognize that there's a system of subjectivization, as he says, and I suppose that this system of subjectivization, as he says, should be our point of departure for discussion next week, where we discuss, the following section of Chapter 1 of Capital, where Marx elaborates and expands upon this notion of the various forms of value that are contained in commodities. Let's use that as our closure.
Right. So I just think that just to really quickly to look at that question, there's no way without confronting them. There's no way without removing power from their hands, because we cannot just build outside of them. And they've shown us many, many, many times that will not be allowed. You will not simply build outside our structure. And they're not going to allow us to just build a parallel society right next to theirs. It's not going to happen. They will. There's all kinds of reasons why that would be difficult, but even if we overcame those difficulties, they'll just come in with brute force and destroy it. Yeah. And they've shown us that many, many times.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll talk about that and other implications. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Your questions, appreciate them. All questions. I happen to enjoy them, even if they're badgering sorts of questions, because they give us an opportunity to discuss stuff. So
all right, so we'll try to work that in next week. We'll work in sincere questions and badgering questions as well next week. We'll try and make that more of a thing.
All right, thank you, Fresno. All right.